Let me start off with the first agenda item, evolution of FRTB guidelines. In the evolution, we shall discuss on the history of FRTB, key changes and components of FRTB, and the selection of different approaches or flavors of FRTB. Let me start with what is FRTB. FRTB stands for Fundamental Review of Trading Book. So basically it is a review of an existing market risk framework after the global financial crisis. So why was the review warranted? Well, during the global financial crisis, it is proved beyond doubt that the existing market risk framework failed to assess and compute the adequate capital for market risk. In fact, it was grossly inadequate. So now the question is, what is this existing framework? As you all know, Basel has introduced the framework for minimum capital requirements for market risk in January of 1996. This was part of Basel II Accord itself. And in response to the global financial crisis of 2008, the BCBS has introduced a set of revisions like stressed VaR, incremental risk capital to this market risk framework in July of 2009. These are often referred to as the Basel 2.5 reforms. In fact, Basel 2.5 is just a stopgap arrangement as it did not address any of the structural deficiencies of market risk framework, and it just focused on the immediate need to ensure adequate capital requirements for trading activities. Now, let us closely look at the timelines. BCBS guidelines on market risk are in existence since 1996. During this 2.5 decades, there are two major revisions to the market risk guidelines. The first one is the Basel 2.5 in 2009, and the second one is the final guidelines of FRTB in 2019. Effectively, both are aimed to address the shortcomings of Basel II. If you look at the number of consultations, for Basel 2.5, there is only one consultation which mainly focused on the internal model approach. In fact, as I previously mentioned, it is just a stopgap arrangement to increase the capital requirements for advanced banks. However, during FRTB, there are 5 consultations as it is a total revamp of market risk guidelines. So I don't have any hesitation in stating that this is the biggest revision that has happened in Basel IV. Let us now see the key objectives of this revision. The main objective of the FRTB was to develop a new, more robust framework to establish the minimum capital requirements for market risk, drawing on the experience of what went wrong in the build-up to the crisis. If you break it down to finer grain, the first objective is to develop an effective trading book and banking book boundary condition. The second is to achieve a regulatory framework that captures and capitalizes all market risk in the trading book. The third is to achieve the comparable levels of capital across the internal risk models and the standardized approach. Because after all, Basel has offered multiple flavors or approach to suit different banks, but the main objective is to precisely compute the capital required, right? So there should not be any undue advantage for internal model approach banks, and hence improve the sensitivity of standardized approach and also brought the output floor concept. We shall discuss the details in the coming slides. Let us now see what are the key deficiencies in the Basel II 2.5 framework and how FRTB has proposed to address these deficiencies. First issue, classification of instruments or positions into banking book or trading book. As per the existing framework, banks intend to trade is the sole basis for classification of instruments into either banking book or the trading book. And we all know, right, banking book exposures are subjected to credit risk capital requirements, and the trading book exposures are subjected to market risk capital requirements. This inherently subjective criteria gives the possibility for the banks to engage in regulatory capital arbitrage. And this is the biggest design weakness. Now, let us look at the remediation of the FRTB. FRTB has been designed to improve the consistency of implementation of this boundary concept and to reduce the arbitrage opportunities between the capital requirements for market risk and credit risk. The basis for the boundary is still the intent to trade, but the framework has been strengthened by additional specifications and enhancements, including additional specification on the appropriate contents of the trading book, enhanced the supervision oversight, mainly on the rationale of classification, restrictions on the ability to arbitrage the boundary, means not allowing any capital savings on account of moving an instrument from one book to another. Apart from all these things, clearer treatment of risk transfers across the boundary. I mean, banks may choose to hedge some of the risks in the banking book via instruments held in the trading book. So, this framework specifies a consistent treatment of internal risk transfers of equity risk and interest rate risk from the banking book to the trading book. By providing these additional specifications, FRTB is going to address this banking book and trading book boundary issue. Hope this helps you. Now, let us look at issue number 2. In fact, it has 2 parts. First, it is related to approval of models. In the current framework, supervisory approval of internal models is at the bank level. So if suddenly a bank fails to renew its approval, banks as a whole will be forced to adopt standardized approach, and there will be a sudden change or cliff effect in the overall capital requirements. Second part is the internal models approach, or value at risk model. We know, right, VAR is not sufficiently comprehensive to incorporate all relevant risk drivers that could actually lead to material losses. VAR basically ignores the tail risk, market illiquidity, and doesn't capture credit risk inherent in the trading positions. On top of it, it accounts hedging and diversification benefits liberally. Now, let us look at its remediation. I shall cover this in a bit detailed manner while explaining the IMA approach, but for now, let me state how FRTB has proposed to address these issues. First, change the model approval from bank level to trade desk level. Second, introduce the accepted shortfall in place of VAR. Third, introduced risk factor level approval to identify the non-modelable risk factors, and also introduced a new revised default risk computation. Now, let us see the issue number 3, the standardized approach. So, the current modified duration or maturity level actually lacks the risk sensitivity and therefore was not a credible alternative and complement to the internal models approach. Furthermore, its calibration remained unchanged from its introduction in 1996. Due to this, there is a huge unexplained variation in the capital computations between the IMM approach and the standardized approach. Now, let us look at the remediation. The revised standardized approach is designed to be more risk sensitive than Basel 2.5 framework. It has 3 components. First, sensitivities based method. Second, standardized default risk capital requirements. And third, residual risk add-on. The sum of these 3 components determines the overall capital requirement. We're going to discuss in detail about this component. So, this gets a snapshot of the key components between Basel 2.5 and Basel 4. Let us start with standardized approach. In the current framework, we are required to compute specific risk charge and general market risk charge. For general market risk charge, there are 2 methods like modified duration or maturity method. As discussed just now in the revised STD, we have 3 components: sensitivity based, default risk, and residual risk add-on. Now, let us look at simplified standardized approach. there is no simplified standardized approach in Basel 2.5. In Basel 4, this has been introduced for small and non-complex banks. The current Basel 2.5 standardized approach will be retained as a simplified alternative with some scalar factors. The scalars per risk class are set at 1.3 for interest rate risk, 1.5 for equity risk, 1.9 for commodity risk, and 1.2 for FX risk. As the scalars are multiplied by the capital requirement calculated under the Basel 2.5 framework, the scalar of 1.3 for the interest rate risk means a 30% increase in capital requirements relative to Basel 2.5. Now, coming to the complex IMM approach, in Basel 2.5 we have VAR, stressed VAR, and IRC. The stressed VAR metric takes better account of tail risk, whereas IRC for both default and migration risk. In Basel 4, we have expected shortfall, non-modelable risk factors, and default risk charge. Let us see which approach is for what bank. By default, the approach that is available for all banks is the standardized approach. For small and non-complex banks, subject to some conditions, banks can follow the simplified standardized approach, which is nothing but a scaled version of Basel 2.5 standardized approach. IMM approach. This is subjected to stringent approval process at different levels such as bank level, trade desk level, and even at the risk factor level. Banks have the option to nominate all or few of their trade desks for approval. Those which are not nominated will be subjected to standardized approach. Trading desks which are nominated are subjected to both the P&L attribution and backtesting. If failed beyond the threshold level, they are subjected to standardized approach. If the failure is within the threshold level, they are allowed to follow IMA approach but need to add capital surcharge. Besides the model approval at each trade desk level, the risk factors are also subjected to an eligibility test mainly based on the observable market prices. So finally, those trade desks which passes both the PLA and backtest and those risk factors which pass the eligibility test will be subjected to IME approach. This graded level of approval helps the regulator to monitor the banks closely and effectively. For the banks, it helps to avoid the cliff effect on the capital charge in case of approval failure.